All right, so we should be able to start in the next minute, but before that I want to invite our host, Dr. Arthur Benomcha, and the representative of the ministry, who is also here representing the minister and the PS, Collins Oloya, to also take the, I don't know who is holding my director, so whoever has the director, please ask him to join us. And also joining us, but is available, Arthur, online, is the country director, CARE International, who is online and he's joining us. So he's actually watching and he's already available. So Arthur, feel free to take your seat. Mine is to request, probably in the next minute, we should be good. Okay. So I want to welcome you all, ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of ACODE and CARE, to this national dialogue. Let's call it an e-conference or e-workshop and dialogue on climate resilience. Our theme, enhancing climate resilience through integrating climate change in planning, programming, and budgeting. We want to welcome you all, those who are joining us via television on NTV, and those who are joining us via Zoom, who are joining us for this conference, that include the country director, CARE International. So I want to request that we all stand for the anthems, and after the anthems, we will have a word of prayer and immediately open the dialogue with the opening remarks. May we stand, ladies and gentlemen, for the anthems, please.
Tutimize na malengo yetu, jumuiya yetu sote tuilinde, tuajibike, tuimarike, umoja wetu ni nguzo yetu, idumu jumuiya yetu. Uzalendo pia mshikamano viwe msingi wa umoja wetu, na tulinde uhuru na amani, mila zetu na desturi zetu. Jumuiya yetu sote tuilinde, tuajibike, tuimarike, umoja wetu ni nguzo yetu, idumu jumuiya yetu. Viwanda viwandani na hata mashambani, tufanye kazi sote kwa makini, tujitoe kwa hali na mali, tuijenge jumuiya bora, jumuiya yetu sote tuilinde, tuajibike, tuimarike, umoja wetu ni nguzo yetu, idumu jumuiya yetu.
Let's remain standing for a word of prayer. I want to request Dr. Arthur to pray for us. You could use that microphone, Arthur.
Let's humble ourselves and pray. Father, in the name of Jesus, we want to thank you for the gift of a new day. We want to thank you, Father, for bringing us safely here. We want to thank you, Father, for the work that you have given us to do in your vineyards. And as we assemble here today, Father, to deliberate about climate change, we pray that, Father, the Holy Spirit will be in our midst and will give us wisdom, knowledge, and understanding. And, Father, that whatever we discuss today will be implemented to promote the development of our country, my Father. We pray that you take the center stage, and may all the glory and the honor return to you through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.
Thank you very much. Dr. Arthur, please take your seats, ladies and gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen, you're once again most welcome to this National Dialogue on Climate Change Resilience. At the onset of COVID, most presentations at that time, or most conversations at that time, was that Uganda was actually facing triple threats at that time, with COVID, the locust invasion, and the floods in western Uganda. As we speak, the situation around the floods is actually across the country, and given the reports we are receiving and the conversations that are ongoing both on social media and in our traditional media platforms. So we want to welcome all of you joining us via Zoom, and those joining us online and on television, on NTV. We want to thank you, but welcome you to what will be findings of the compliance assessment of the 2020-2021 budget to climate change interventions in the NDP3, dissemination of guidelines for mainstreaming climate change adaptation and mitigation in the agriculture sector policies and plans, management of catchment areas in enhancing climate resilience in the country, and the progress made by local governments in integrating and implementing climate change. Other presentations this morning and the early afternoon will include the Climate Change Department, CCD, coordination of climate change interventions. We are very hopeful that this platform will provide a discussion of climate change integration into sector plans, programs, and budgets, and inform those interventions in the same areas, but also to disseminate the guidelines for mainstreaming climate change adaptation and mitigation in agriculture sector policies and plans. And so we want to welcome you to this very important dialogue, virtual dialogue, here at the Imperial Royal Hotel. To welcome us, allow me to invite Dr. Arthur Benomcha, the Executive Director of ACODE, to make his remarks. You're welcome, sir.
Master of Ceremonies, Mr. Morris Mujisha, the Director, Environmental Affairs, Minister of Water and Environment, representing the Permanent Secretary, Minister of Water and Environment, the Country Director, Care International, Mr. Apollo B. Kabazira, distinguished panelists, invited guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. A good morning to you all. Let me take this opportunity on behalf of the Advocates Coalition for Development and Environment to warmly welcome all of you to this very important dialogue on climate resilience, which is organized in partnership between the Advocates Coalition for Development and Environment and CARE International. Let me also take this opportunity to applaud the Minister of Water and Environment for providing leadership in spearheading the responses to climate change that is ravaging a country and indeed countries of the world. For purposes of clarity, climate change, when we talk about climate change, ladies and gentlemen, within here and out of here, basically we are talking about a phenomenon that is characterized by a change in the average conditions, such as temperatures and rainfall in the region or in a country over a long period of time. This pattern became apparent from the mid to the late 20th century, and it has now become worse in the last 20 years. And what basically causes this is largely because of the use of fossil fuels. Of course, in our country here, we have also tampered with the environment. We've destroyed the forest cover. We have mismanaged agricultural farming systems. We've destroyed the wetlands. And we've continued to be dependent on natural resources and the environment, causing a lot of environmental stress. Of course, the population, especially across much of Africa, has also been increasing, and yet technologically we have not advanced. So causing a lot of stress and pressure on natural resources, and now Mother Earth has revolted. There have been serious consequences because of climate change here at home and across the region and indeed across the world. At home here, we have, of course, experienced erratic rainfall patterns, reduced actually rains, changed weather patterns, confusing even farmers when to plant and when not to plant. We've seen a lot of catastrophes characterized by landslides in areas like Bududa, Bundubujo, Kasese. We also recently, of course, witnessed the rising levels of Lake Victoria, which destroyed actually a lot of livelihoods of communities and reversing a lot of progress that this country has recorded in terms of economic development. As you realize, Uganda has made had made a lot of strides in terms of economic development, reducing poverty, reducing the number of people living below the poverty levels. But because of the climate change and its consequences, we've seen a number of our people sliding back into poverty. In 2016, 2017, we saw prolonged droughts that actually reversed our economic progress. While the country had recorded a decline in number of people living below poverty to 19, we saw a jump to 21. But now this has also been, it has been much affected by the COVID-19. COVID-19, which has actually, the consequence of COVID-19, about 3 million Ugandans have slipped back into poverty. Now, climate change, COVID-19 has really been very, very terrible, and yet Uganda is also ranked as one of those countries that doesn't have a very robust climate change resilience approaches. That's unfortunate. Certainly, to combat climate change and its adverse effects, one would need a robust legal policy and institutional framework. As we talk now, the bill on climate change is still before Parliament, and it has been before Parliament for a long, long time. And the representative of the minister, Mr. Colin Zoloya, I'm talking to you now. I think that this bill has dragged on for a long time, and I think Ugandans deserve to have a legal mechanism in place to combat climate change. Why is it taking long? Does it mean that Uganda doesn't see that actually climate change is so linked with all the progress we are making in other sectors? So I think one of the recommendations of this meeting today is to tell Parliament that actually before the end of this Parliament, we should pass this legislation so that we can then have a legal framework in place to use it. But we also have an opportunity. While climate change presents this kind of doomsday scenario, there are opportunities. We have NDP 3, the National Development Plan 3, coming in place. It's very impressive and progressive, and want to use this opportunity to mainstream responses, especially the budget, tilt the budget architecture of this country to mainstream climate change approaches so that actually we can respond appropriately and reverse the adverse conditions of climate change. Ladies and gentlemen, just before I conclude, I want to thank you for finding time to come and attend this dialogue, whose major objective is to provide a platform to discuss climate change mainstreaming at national and local levels in order to enhance climate change resilience. And it has two specific objectives: provide a platform for discussion of climate change integration in sector plans, programs and budgets, and inform interventions. Two, to disseminate the guidelines for mainstreaming climate change adaptation and mitigation in agricultural sector policies and plans. I appeal to you to be frank, to be honest, and come out with candid recommendations that we can put across to our policymakers so that we can respond to this pandemic on its own, because climate change is also a pandemic like COVID. But the good news is that we can combat it successfully, as we are busy combating COVID-19, as Uganda is one of the top 10 countries that have responded very positively in combating COVID-19. I thank you for listening. God bless you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Arthur. And as you noticed, we are observing all the set standard operating procedures during this pandemic, and we are socially distanced in this room, and the majority of our audience and participants are also joining us online, which will be showcased very shortly when I invite the Country Director, Care, to join us. But as we set him up, because we are going to the Country Director shortly via Zoom, I did want to mention, as Arthur has said, that this conversation on climate change has been a priority, especially in the last few weeks. Not so long ago with the Water Week, Water and Environment Week at the Ministry of Water, the climate change discussion had a session on its own and featured very clearly on the agenda for the week, and is actually a priority for the Ministry of Water. And I see the different stakeholders and officials from the ministry here, including our guest of honor. So before I invite our guest of honor, allow me to invite our Country Director, Care International, Mr. Apollo Gabazira, to join us via Zoom and make his remarks. Apollo, if you can hear me, you're welcome, and please go ahead. Apollo, you can hear me? Because I know he's online, and we actually have him. So I just need to make sure he can hear me and we can actually listen. Do we have Apollo? Okay. Do we need some time, Joseph, for Apollo? All right. I will now request, with your permission, Doctor, that we invite a representative from the ministry who is here representing the minister and also the permanent secretary, and will be speaking to us as making official opening remarks on behalf of the Ministry of Water and Environment. Welcome with me, ladies and gentlemen, Collins Oloya, who is the Acting Director, Environment Affairs, and also Commissioner, Wetland Management Department. You're most welcome, sir.
Good morning, colleagues. All the government officials present, development partners present, the organizer of this dialogue, ACODE and CARE International in Uganda, present, all the civil society members who have turned up, the academia, the media fraternity, participants who are here both physically present and those participating online. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Collins Oloya. I'm representing Minister of Water and Environment, and also the Permanent Secretary, Minister of Water and Environment, but I'm the Acting Director, Environment Affairs in the Ministry of Water and Environment. So the Minister could not be with us here because of a number of demanding engagements which are across the country. So he has delegated me to come and preside over this opening dialogue meeting. The PS could also not be with you here because, you know, we are at the moment coordinating program planning issued by Minister of Finance and National Planning Authority, so he could not be in this dialogue. But spiritually and physically, they are all here with us. So now let me read the speech from the minister to the participants who have come for this dialogue. It gives me great pleasure to preside over this important dialogue meeting on climate resilience. The dialogue meeting has come at the right time when the government of Uganda is developing the program-based planning and budgeting for sustainable development in Uganda. So the program-based planning means we have to address outcomes, and among the outcomes and the outputs is addressing climate change. So one of the programs which addresses climate change is environment, natural resources, climate change, land, and water management. So this is where the issues to address climate change specifically will be handled. I also take this opportunity to thank all of you who have turned up at the short notice to deliberate on this important topic affecting all mankind in different hemispheres and globally. The topic for the dialogue and the themes are very relevant and timely because globally and more specifically, Uganda is experiencing the effects and impacts of climate change in all sectors. Ladies and gentlemen, climate change poses a development challenge. It's not only an environmental challenge, but both of the challenges. Globally, climate change represents one of the most challenging threats to sustainable development. And in this respect, the target set for the African Union Agenda 63, the East African Agenda 50, Uganda Vision 240, NDP 1, 2, and 3, the Uganda NDC, the Sustainable Development Goal will not be achieved if nothing is done at this moment. In Uganda, the country has experienced floods that have wreaked havoc on livestock, crops, human life countrywide. The day before yesterday, our field staff who went to different parts of Uganda presented what they saw on the ground as a result of the rising water level and the subsequent flooding. So all parts of Uganda which are low-lying, we term them flood plains, were greatly affected. The most affected one is in Toroko district. Another district is Bulisa, in Teso. So all parts of Uganda has been affected. That's the challenge. One of the challenges of changing climate and weather in terms of too much rainfall and little vegetations to absorb the amount to regulate its release, resulting in rising water level. The country has also experienced changes in weather patterns, which has led to prolonged droughts, erratic rains, leading to crop failures and poor harvest, landslide and storms where the population has lost property and life. Ladies and gentlemen, if you look at that reports, you will shed tears because even the cows, the cattle are dying. Even the wildlife, because of excess water in their habitats and niches, are dying. Even fish, we should have been very happy because there is sufficient water, they are also dying. So what about human beings? All the roads, the feeder roads, have been cut off. Some bridges wash off. You even know that our national asset, that is the Owen Falls Dam, all the series of dams were about to be washed off because of too much rain. So you can see it's a big development challenges which we have to address. Ladies and gentlemen, specific to the vulnerable groups, the rural women's workload, like fuel, wood, and water collection, is worsened by natural disasters. In Uganda, for example, women are responsible for 7 to 80% of the agricultural production and for nutrition and food security at household level. Yet, women only own 16% of registered land. The effects of climate change make all the traditional tasks of rural Uganda women increasingly uncertain and dangerous. Whether it is cultivating the fields or collecting firewood and water. There is also escalating domestic violence. Research conducted in Uganda by the Mary Robinson Foundation for Climate Justice reveals how climate change impacts are creating tensions between women and men who respectively were predominantly responsible for food crops to feed the family and cash crops to earn an income. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you, all of us who are here, you are not falling victims of that violence in the home as a result of climate change. As climate change reduces growing time and rainfall becomes scarce and unpredictable, tensions are rising over which crops to grow and prioritize. These tensions can lead to conflict, including domestic violence, especially when rains are poor and yields are low. Moreover, when food is limited due to a poor harvest, women prioritize feeding their children and male spouses and reduce their own intake to the detriment of their overall nutrition and health. This is very serious because they will either feed the children or the spouse and they sleep hungry. So what would be their productivity level? Ladies and gentlemen, climate change challenge will take some time to address both at national and global level. As a result, climate change adaptation is critical for us. Building resilience of communities and the economy to climate change shocks is critical for the country. So therefore, what has the government of Uganda done and has been doing all this time. First, Uganda developed the climate change policy and costed implementation framework in 2015 and disseminated to all sectors. This is being implemented in all sectors. Uganda has also established a standing committee on climate change in parliament to coordinate climate change issues at parliamentary level. In terms of implementation framework, we have embarked on the development of legal regimes to help address the climate change. The draft climate bill is at its last consultative level in Parliament. They are remaining to sit once and finalize the language of the bill. So we are working tirelessly to ensure that the bills come in. The only problem which has delayed the conclusion of this bill is, you know, why we are wearing the mask here. That is the main reason. It is difficult to convene Parliament, cabinets at one sitting to finalize on this bill. But we are pushing for it. We are finished with the President's office, the Cabinet Secretariat has given us a go-ahead, and we hope by the end of this financial year, it will be completed. Or by March this year, it will be completed. The government, through the Ministry of Water and Environment, has also developed guidelines for mainstreaming and budgeting for climate change. And if you look at the budget call circulars, now makes it mandatory for all sectors to include the output from climate change intervention and the budget associated with this. We have not done evaluation to assess the compliance level. I think NPA will have to do that so that we know that all sectors are complying. Uganda, you know very well that in April, Uganda was supposed to host the Climate Change Week, and all preparations were done. We have got every go-ahead approvals, and some funding were already about to be released. But because of the COVID, this has been halted, postponed at the moment, but we will do that. And this one was in preparation for Uganda to be represented eloquently in the COP26 in United Kingdom. My ministry has also embarked on the plantation of 40 million trees in a day, which plan was at the advanced stage, and we mobilized the resources. The seedlings were scattered in about 32 nurseries all over Uganda, but because of the advent of the climate change, this could not also be implemented. So this is what the government of Uganda has been doing. Uganda was the first country in Africa to develop and endorse its nationally determined contribution partnership plan in June 2018. It made key commitments in this regard, including reducing national greenhouse gas emissions by 22% by the year 2030, reducing climate vulnerability of climate change sensitive sectors since the economy is natural resource based, and building climate resilience of key sectors and managing disaster risk. Ladies and gentlemen, compared to other countries, Uganda ranks high in its number of commitments regarding climate change mitigation and environmental protection. The country has launched its national climate change policy 2015, submitted a national determined contribution to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in 2018, has a green growth strategy in place, and has signed up to meet the Bond Challenge. The Bond Challenge is a forestry-based treaty, which obliges Uganda to plant 2.5 million trees by the year 2030. So all these are to address climate change issues. Furthermore, to address the impact of climate change, Uganda has put in the National Policy for Disaster Preparedness and Management. The overall policy goal and objectives for disaster risk management is to reduce vulnerability levels, risk mitigation, disaster prevention, preparedness, effective response and recovery in a manner that integrates disaster risk management with development planning and programming. This approach will ensure people of Uganda build capacities that would enable them minimize serious social and economic disruption as a result of disaster events. The policy has created an integrated and multi-sectoral systems approach to planning, preparedness, and management of disaster, which is fundamental to sustain productivity and socioeconomic growth. Ladies and gentlemen, despite all the efforts I've enumerated and those which I've not enumerated, there still remains a number of challenges which needs to be addressed. First and foremost, there is limited integration of climate change issues in planning, programming, and budgeting. I told you we prepared the guidelines and we disseminated. We even approached NPA and Ministry of Finance to ensure that all sectors, before their budget framework papers is approved, there should be evidence that you have integrated that. So we have not achieved so much, but we are trying to push forward that. So that is still a challenge. If this is done, then you will see the impact of climate change will be reduced because all sectors will be addressing that. Furthermore, there is limited disaggregated data on the impacts of climate change on women and other vulnerable groups to inform interventions by government and other stakeholders. Last but not least, among the challenges, there is limited resource envelope to implement early disaster prediction and warning system to carry out necessary and timely intervention when disasters occur. My ED of UNMA is here. Is supposed to ensure that everybody is aware of when the northeast trade wind is coming, the southeast trade wind is coming, the rainfall distribution in intensity, and the likelihood of the flood, because there is limited funding to the agency which is empowered to ensure that early warning is provided from UNMA and also from the Director of Water Resources Management. Because if those two institutions are working, then we will be prepared. We know when to move our animals from the flood zones to a safer place, how to build our bridges, how to do whatever for socioeconomic development. So these two institutions are not funded adequately to ensure that those things are addressed. Ladies and gentlemen, government cannot address the challenge alone and will need the concerted efforts of all stakeholders. So all stakeholders who are here, you are very critical and diligent, and you want climate change to be addressed. So let us come together, work in hand, and use the programming-based approach to address climate change. Ladies and gentlemen, to conclude, I'm really very happy that today's dialogue focuses on some of the challenges which I've enumerated. I want to thank the organizer for this dialogue, ACODE and CARE International. These are very supporting national NGOs who are really very concerned about environment, its impact, and climate change. So I really thank you very much, ED ACODE, and country representative of CARE International for funding this, organizing and funding this dialogue, so that all the citizens are able to provide their input, their resolution, which will be handed over to the program working group, which climate change is anchored in. I want also to thank the participants, and I look forward to receiving the recommendation from this dialogue to guide my ministry, which is the Secretariat for Environment, Natural Resources, Climate Change, Land, and Water Management, to integrate this. Now I take the singular honor to declare the dialogue open and wish you good deliberation. This is for God and my country, Honorable Minister of Water and Environment, Sam Cheptoris. I conclude here. Thanks. Now, due to program-based planning, I will not be with you for a long time here because I have to go and see how we are addressing all this, what we are discussing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, sir. And thank you for officially opening the conference. I will learn from you on the sanitizing of the microphone. We are not taking any chances. This thing is serious. Okay, so we will have the remarks of the country director, CARE, a little later, as soon as we have him online. I want us to move straight into our conversation and probably invite Bob Natifu and Dr. Kalist to take the seats at the front because we are coming to you. And the format for this discussion is that some of our presenters have presentations and will later be open to questions from myself and of course from you who are here and those joining us online. And if you're watching on Zoom, you can actually share your comment or question in the comment section. We should be able to pick it and share with us. I'm told we have Apollo. Is Apollo with us? Can we confirm that we have Apollo? Because it would be nice to have Apollo and then we continue with our presentations. Do we have Apollo, the country director, CARE International? Just checking. Apollo, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Do you hear me? Hello? Hello? Maurice, do you hear me? Do you hear me? Yes. Okay. Maurice, do you hear me? Okay. Okay, so I'll make my remarks. I apologize for the technology hit. Good morning again. My name is Apollo Gabazira, and I am the country director for CARE International in Uganda, the partner to ACODE in this very important climate change initiative in Uganda, regionally, and across the world. Climate change, as we know, affects everyone. So the representative of the minister, who I think has made his remarks already, government of Uganda officials that are gathered here with us this morning, the ED ACODE, Bwana Dr. Bainomugisha, the civil society fraternity that are gathered here this morning, ladies and gentlemen. I stand here on behalf of CARE International, and everywhere CARE stands before people, before society, like I do this morning, we represent women and girls, vulnerable women and girls. And it's our vision to see a world filled with hope, inclusion, and social justice for women and girls, and where poverty has been overcome. That's how ambitious we are when it comes to matters poverty. However, as many of you have already mentioned, it's no secret that matters to do with climate change are taking us back, setting us back on the progress we've made on the development landscape over the last 50 to 60 years. We know that the majority of people in Uganda, again, mainly women, and I'm told the number is 72%, are engaged in agriculture. subsistence, quasi-subsistence agriculture. And when climate change starts to come on full board with all its negative effects, it obviously affects women and girls. When agriculture fails, ladies and gentlemen, the fallback position for many vulnerable and marginalized people is, of course, exploitation of natural resources. They fall back to destroying, not because they want to, but because they have to survive. They fall back to destroying forests, to cultivating food in wetlands, because the normal land that they would use for cultivating has been affected by drought as a result of climate change. So every time we deal with climate change in this country, we know that natural resources do get negatively impacted. Building resilience to climate change, therefore, for us as an agency and for those civil society practitioners we are working with, like ACODE and others in this country and gathered in this room this morning and online, climate change is a matter of urgency that requires a multi-pronged approach by all stakeholders. Whoever sits back and believes that climate change will not impact them, whether it's in Uganda, whether it's somewhere in the world like in the US, is actually playing with fire. Climate change adaptation measures need to be integrated, not only in development planning, but also in budgeting and the eventual implementation of government plans. And as a civil society organization, CARE is thrilled to have learned this morning from the officers of government that climate change is being taken seriously at that level. Women are often, as I've already mentioned, directly and severely impacted by climate change. While at the same time, we know that women have got this unique creative ability to cope in society. So when they're impacted by climate change, then we lose their ability, their competence, their knack, their natural knack for being the enablers of society on a day-to-day basis. I'm sure if you go to any Ugandan village today, even as I talk, the life, the continuity we see in those villages in terms of food security, in terms of health for the children in these homes, in terms of school for these children, is actually driven by women. Women are at the forefront of such critical social initiatives in society. Empowering women, therefore, for us as CARE and for those we work with, becomes a critical matter for decision makers, for advocates of the rights of the vulnerable, and for people, leaders, and other well-wishers gathered in this room. We recognize as CARE, and again with our partners, that vulnerability to shocks that arise from the phenomena, as we've said, in this case, climate change and conflict, is a key underlying cause of poverty. And if not addressed in a holistic, systematic manner, we stand again to lose all the gains we've made. As an institution, I'll want to briefly share that as an institution, climate justice is at the fore of our strategic agenda and interests globally, regionally, and nationally. At the global level, CARE International has set an ambitious target of ensuring that 25 million poor and vulnerable people, especially women and girls, as I've said again, all through my speech, have the adaptive capacity and strengthened resilience to the effects of climate change. And we want to do this by 2030. So it's just a few years from now. We should have impacted 25 million people globally. At country level, if I may quickly focus on that, at the Uganda country level, CARE is in the process of articulating our strategic plan, our new business plan. And in there, one of the key programmatic foci is climate justice. We want to build resilience to climate change through three key pillars, and I'll quickly touch them. Disaster risk reduction, and I've had speakers this morning talk to that directly and indirectly. Natural resource governance, NRG, as well as renewable energy. How can we not talk renewable energy given the pressure on natural resources, especially forests, that I've mentioned in my speech earlier on? Having said that, and as I conclude this morning, ladies and gentlemen, we have a call to action that is not only by CARE, but seen by well-wishers gathered here this morning, online, and those that are not with us. This is a call to action to the government of Uganda. With our support, to the extent we can, we think we can deal with the four issues I'm going to quickly share. One is to integrate climate change into development strategies and plans no later than 2022, so in about 2 years' time, plus implement more concrete measures which strengthen gender equality and are compatible with the efforts required to build resilience of the poorest populations. In our case, women and girls, but in general, all the vulnerable people in Uganda. Second call to action, ladies and gentlemen, and for the officers of government seated here with us this morning, is to significantly increase finance for gender-just climate resilience measures. As we put money to climate activities, to resilience activities, let's look at this money, let's deploy this money through the lens of the vulnerable women and girls. That is, as I've said already, a critical enabler in the day-to-day running of Ugandan society. The third call to action, ladies and gentlemen, officers of government, is to increase efforts to integrate gender equality across all climate measures in the country. And I know ACODE has done a lot of work in this area, working with the National Planning Authority. I was at a workshop a few weeks back, and we call upon you to accompany us on this job and take it on as the government, as ministries, as the people running this country. And finally, the fourth call to action, ladies and gentlemen, is to develop and widely disseminate climate weather-related information in a bid to support adaptation and reduction of risks and vulnerabilities. Yes, we can deal with climate issues. Yes, we may have the will to do that, but we can't do that in the dark. We cannot be seen to be painting in the dark. For us to target action, for us to have impact for our action, we need to have the right information system. So let's disseminate weather-related information. We pledge as a global civil society organization with our partners in Uganda and well-wishers that climate change will continue to be an area of focus for us, and we pledge our support as an agency towards the realization of the government of Uganda aspirations in responding to climate change, as indeed set out in NDP 3. I was at a meeting with Dr. Mvala, the ED of the National Planning Authority, and this issue was at the forefront of the discussion then, and I'm sure it will continue to be. We can only commit our support, our accompaniment to this, and I'll conclude by thanking you, Arthur, and your team at ACODE for inviting us to this critical event, for accepting to work with us as we front something that is critical not only to Uganda, but to the world, and will negatively impact generations to come if we don't wake up and act now. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, moderator. Can I be helped to project? Okay, thank you very much. Morning, ladies and gentlemen. I will just run you through my presentation very fast. I've been requested by the organizers to talk about management of water catchment areas for enhanced climate resilience. So I would like to thank ACODE and the rest of the organizing team for inviting me. Basically, for those of you who are working in the field of water and environment, you know that these resources don't follow administrative boundaries. Water will flow and will always pass where it has always passed. It doesn't recognize the boundary of Uganda. It also doesn't care how many districts we have in Uganda. It will continue flowing. So a catchment is an area that contributes water to a common point. Now, a catchment can be as big as the whole country, can be as big as a number of districts. So when we are doing our work, we define the catchment in many ways. We have a bigger area, a catchment, could even be a basin, but also we have smaller areas called sub-catchments, also smaller areas close to the communities called micro-catchments. And this is how we do our work. But these catchments, as I've mentioned, will cut across boundaries. We already have those areas that contribute water to Uganda, actually the water coming from as far as Burundi. For example, we have Kagera Basin. We have water coming from Burundi, from Rwanda, from Tanzania, and parts of DRC. We have water coming from Kenya. So when we are managing water, when we are planning for the use of water and related resources, we have to remember that these resources may come from outside countries, and we have to work with those countries. But what happens within a catchment? Everything happens there. From the water resources point of view, our source of water is rainfall. And when this rainfall reaches the surface, some of it will run on the surface in rivers, goes into lakes. Some of it will go underground, and that's the water we tap through drilling boreholes and wells. But all uses of water are found there. We have, for example, hydropower, we have irrigation, domestic water supply, fisheries, but also have activities that affect the water. So when all of these activities are taking place in a catchment, you have to make sure that all of these users, all of these stakeholders are brought together. And in most situations, they don't talk with each other. And that's the challenge we have. So when we are going to improve resilience to climate change, you need to remember that all of these stakeholders, all these uses have to be harmonized. And in the country, and I think it was mentioned during the opening, we're already having challenges. In some situations, have too little water, so people are crying. In some situations, have too much water, again, people are crying. Even too dirty water. And the situation is being made worse by high population growth rate and climate change. So when we are doing our work, we have to manage the situation where we have too much water, we see how we manage it to ensure that it doesn't become a problem. Right now, in many parts of the country, we are having flooding because we're having too much water. And yet we need this water for drinking as our first priority, water for people. They say a big percentage of our bodies is actually made up of water, and you cannot survive without water. We need water for food. Right now, we are going into irrigation. How shall we get this water to be able to produce food? We need water for nature, but also we need water for other uses. Hydropower generation, oil and gas, industry, and many other areas. So we have to look at the catchment because many things happen in the catchment. Already we are having challenges that we are having conflicts over the resources there. The catchments are degraded. We have bare hills, and when it rains, the water moves very fast. We have the quality of the water is actually not good. We're having waterborne diseases increasing. We have invasive species. We're having water hyacinths all over. Many of our water bodies are affected by water hyacinths. Ecotourism sites are being affected. We are now having unplanned industrial, mining, and urban expansion. Right now we have cities coming up. How much have we prepared these cities so that they can actually develop in a sustainable manner? It's a challenge. Flood risks are increasing, but again, we have these resources not following our border. So we need to plan. So how have we responded as a country? We have realized that we cannot continue business as usual, so we have decided to move closer to where people are. We have divided the country into 4 regions we call water management zones. These are areas which contribute water to our common borders. For example, the water that comes from Lake Victoria to Lake Victoria comes as far as Kabale. Very little of this water actually comes from around Kampala. The water that feeds Lake Albert comes from as near as Bwaise. The Bwaise water doesn't come to Lake Victoria. So if you are going to address climate change issues and flooding, you have to track how this water moves. For example, the water that affects Teso comes from Karamoja. Flooding in Butareja comes from Elgon. So you cannot solve a flooding problem in Butareja without taking action in Elgon. You cannot solve a flooding problem in Teso without doing something in Karamoja. And then, of course, we have areas that contribute to water to the Nile as it moves. So as a country, we have strategically decided to manage this water so that it becomes an opportunity and helps us to address impacts of climate change. So I've divided the country into 4 major regions, water management zones. Within there, we have smaller units called catchments, those areas that contribute water to common points. And within those catchments, we have gone further to identify the stakeholders, because at the end of the day, it's the people we are trying to work with, it's the people that are going to help us address these impacts. So we have people from the household, through community, up to the national level, and we bring them together, so we are creating what we call catchment management organizations. All the way from the catchment, the bigger one, to the sub and the micro, up to the village level, so that people can take responsibility for their actions. And we bring them together to prepare a plan. So for each catchment, we are bringing the stakeholders to prepare a plan so that we have coordinated actions. So we need information, we promote participation, and we get them to take decisions. We have also developed catchment planning guidelines, and we are right now working in 18 catchments in the country, and these catchments have plans. We are bringing some copies of these plans, so you will get some copies, some of you, but we can also share. So we want people, first of all, to be guided on what they can do, come together, and be able to take action. So I want to run through a practical example of what we are doing to manage catchments, to enhance climate resilience, and I bring the Greece catchment. It has been in the papers, but it's an area where we're also working with ACODE. So Riz catchment has 10 districts. It has a lot of water, but the water is not available. You always hear that Riz is drying up. So it receives a lot of rainfall, but this water comes, when the rain season comes, the water flushes through and causes flooding. But this water is also coming with a lot of silt. So the water is turbid. Treating this water is a problem. So we have flash floods during the wet season, but also we have water scarcity during the dry season. So we recognize that we need to do something to protect the catchment. And here what I show above is the average flow of the water, of the river, but what I see the lower is the raw flow. So we have a lot of water during the rainy season, but very little water during the dry season. So what is happening in the Riz catchment? And we have tried to look at the catchment, starting with the upstream, the midstream, and the lower stream. Upstream, here areas, the wetlands have been degraded. What you see there are wetlands which have been turned into gardens. When it rains, all the water runs with soil, and you don't have any storage. So you cannot talk about improving resilience with this kind of situation. You have to do something. In the middle, that's where we have Mbarara Town and others, a lot of activity, construction, brick making. We have industries, We have waste disposal, a lot of pollution taking place. You go on the lower part, those are areas of Rakai and Chotera. Here, that's where we have tourism. Again, we have Ramsar sites, but also we have challenges that the water is actually not reaching there in adequate quantities. So we have ongoing interventions. We are restoring the degraded wetlands. We are turning gardens, which were originally wetlands, into wetlands. So what you see here on the left side is a garden, which was a wetland, but through interventions with the communities, the water has come up, and these wetlands are now storing the water. We are seeing the water being stored, and we can say we are helping the people to improve the resilience to climate change. Here they have the water, even to do their agriculture. Upstream, we are storing the water. We are harvesting water to address challenges of flash floods, loss of vegetation, and also we have had water supplies actually drying up. So here we are harvesting water, and what you can see here, again, intervention which can be done by the people themselves. Here people are putting their stone bands to reduce the rate of flow of the water, but they are constructing some small check dams. Here what you can see, flooding comes and erosion takes place, and here we are getting the people, even on their gardens, even their banana plantations, to harvest the water, and we are already seeing productivity increasing, and people already are demonstrating, clearly indicating that the harvests have increased because they are actually protecting the catchment. Here, again, the people are doing small things that people can do, but which can cause a very big difference. But we are also demarcating river banks so that these can perform their functions. As you can see here, this is Mbarara town. This is River Ruiz, very dirty, and people are discharging all of the waste. Some of them close to Mbarara Hospital. So we are demarcating them and ensuring that those river banks are protected. Again, here, this is what is happening. Our approach has been public awareness. We are also facilitating participatory planning. It's the people who are doing this work. So for each of the catchments, we are creating a catchment management organization, and these are the people who are doing the work. We are also having practical sessions where people are doing work on the ground, learning from each other, but we have also had exchange visits so that people can move and learn from each other. Our main stakeholders are everybody, government agencies, local governments, civil society organizations, private sector, development partners, faith-based organizations, cultural institutions, and that's why we would like really to appreciate the support we have got from ACODE, WWF, Coca-Cola, Nile Breweries, and many others working with us in Ruiz. We have a number of partnerships. Our strategy is partnership. We do believe that you cannot cause change without working with the others. And we have already MOU signed with a number of partners. One of them is ACODE, CARE. We have an MOU with CARE, IUCN, WWF, and also private companies, and it is making a very big difference. In conclusion, we do feel that if we are going to address climate change issues and improve resilience, you have to track how these issues happen, and we do believe that the catchment is the logical way, because that's where you can bring the stakeholders together and ensure that they work together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kalist. Please now make your way to the front on the panel table, and also allow me to invite Bob and Ronald to do the same. So we'll open this session up because we want to dissect a couple of issues, and all the three have some questions they will be answering from myself. So as I introduce them, allow me to introduce our speakers, or at least our panelists. Just sitting is Bob Natifu, the Acting Commissioner, Climate Change Department, and also joining them is Mr. Ronald Kagwa, the Manager, Head Production, Trade and Tourism Planning Department at the National Planning Authority. Since we are speaking to NDP3 and how climate change is actually being addressed in all the spheres of our planning and budgeting. Okay, so I want to begin with Bob, and Bob will be specifically speaking to the coordination of integration of climate change in government programs and an update on Uganda's progress on implementing of the commitments to the international climate change agreements. So Bob, I will technically start with you. I wanted you to speak to us and feel free to give us more context to this information. The coordination mechanisms that the ministry has put in place to ensure that climate change is integrated in government planning and programming. Bob?
Okay, thanks very much, moderator. Good morning, colleagues, and good morning, viewers, wherever you're watching from. You've put to me two or three key questions. The first one largely lies about coordination. Perhaps to tackle that, the question we should ask ourselves first is why coordination in the first place? You realize that climate change manifests itself in water. You've just heard Dr. Kalist eloquently talking about it. Manifests itself in forestry, manifests itself in wetlands, manifests itself in fisheries, in agriculture, livestock, but ultimately it poses a danger to the individual livelihood and well-being of our people, which we call on our side building resilience of our people so that they can be able to overcome the impacts that we're faced with. So with that in hindsight, we see coordination largely at three levels. The first coordination mechanism, we look at, for example, who brings what on table and what can they be able to do to help us build a resilient community. We have development partners on one side, which, as you may like, can bring in either strategic guidance or advice, including resources. So we also have the at sectoral level, where we have ministries, departments, and agencies, because that's where strategic planning happens, and that's where also information is needed to help us as a coordinating entity to, for example, come up with emission profiles across the different sectors. But we also have the same arrangement is mirrored down at subnational level, district local governments, where we see working with various departments, but also committees that exist at subnational level. In part, could be implementing climate action, but also helping us collect information and data that is required at national level to ensure that we come up with meaningful plans to address resilience. On the other side, in terms of legislation, we also have a standing committee on Parliament, which, as we know, to have a very effective coordination mechanism, we have to be very much grounded in the legal framework. So we see all these three playing out, and we think that to be able to harness the potential of all these three, we need a legal framework in place, and that is the climate change bill that we're talking about, to help strengthen this coordination, because it's all about making sure that the various institutions provide information to us as a national coordinating entity to be able to come up with meaningful resilience plans that the country requires to improve individual livelihood and well-being. That's on the part of coordination. On the part of the second question was commitments. It would be unfair to talk about commitments before we talk about where we are coming from with these commitments. So when we talk about commitments, at global level, we have signed to and ratified three key instruments. The first one being the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. The second one being the Kyoto Protocol, and until recently, the 2015, where we signed up to the Paris Agreement. And all these protocols speak largely to one thing. For example, the convention itself, the ultimate objective is about ensuring that we stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere at a level that doesn't allow dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. What does that mean? That means that as a country, we are supposed to decouple two trajectories that have moved hand in hand for a very long time. The trajectory of global GDP, call it economic development, but also on the other hand, the trajectory of increasing emissions, which we know as they are continuously being pumped out in the atmosphere, they lead to the distortion in the climate system and thereabout causing the impacts that we are faced with. Same applies to the Kyoto Protocol, which was so much about binding commitments to the developed nations. But the most current one, which is the Paris Agreement, speaks about strengthening the global response to the threat posed by climate change. But most importantly, talking about how do we maintain temperature rise to well below 2 degrees centigrade, and actually while maintaining 1.5 on the table. So within that realm, in terms of maintaining temperature rise to well below 2 degrees centigrade, we've defined ourselves as a country, the kind of commitments or targets that we think contribute to those broad objectives that I've just explained. One, we talk about increasing renewable energy generation from what it was in 2013, from 927 megawatts to about 3,200 by 2030. The second commitment is on the forestry, where at the time we did the carbon management plan that we did in 2015, where we posit increasing forestry cover from 10.9% as it was in 2013 to 12% by 2030. And there's a lot of effort which is being done, as you could have heard from the representative of the minister on the PS. The effort in the ministry already, where we have a 40 million tree campaign. So those are some of the things that are contributing to some of the targets that we've set ourselves to achieve. The last commitment is wetlands, which we aim at increasing wetland protection from about 10% as it were in 2014 to about 13% by 2030. So, and already again there's been bits of effort not only to tackle greenhouse gases but to ensure that you improve livelihood of people who've been living through the wetlands so that they can have a decent living. So all these, as you see, we frame them as nature-based solutions because that's the advantage that we're trying to put forward as a country. But we are not saying nature-based solutions are an alpha and omega, that they finish all the challenges that we are faced with on climate change. And that's why we go into conversations with different partners to say, look, we have put forward a bit of ambition in nature-based solutions where we think by addressing these issues, we are going to contribute globally to reducing emissions, but also contributing to ensuring that temperature remains well below 2 degrees centigrade. But we're also saying that doesn't replace the technology that we require in order to ensure that we contribute to that broad objective, but also the financing that is required in country to actually walk the talk. In terms of financing, we've also tried to come up with clear estimates on what we require in order to meet the obligations that we've set ourselves to achieve. So this requires partnerships, requires collaboration, and that's why I said in the coordination framework already we have the development partners on one side, we have ministries, departments, and agencies, and we have all other different sectors, including civil society and private sector. To conclude on this, whilst the things I've put forward is so much about emission reductions, that may not make so much sense to an ordinary person. What we think, what we've clearly emphasized as government is that our emission profiles are significantly low. So what we need to see is how do we advance action on the adaptation front. So we define ourselves first as an adaptation-first country because that's where the biggest problem is, improving individual livelihood and well-being, but ultimately eradicating poverty because that's the key underlying point. But as we move ahead, because we know addressing climate change is not something that is going to be done between now and the 5-year cycles, we are looking forward to ensuring that we come up with more ambitious and robust programs between now and 2030 2030 and between now mid-century and towards the end of the century to see how we can address emissions if they increase from what we are contributing to globally, which is only 0.001%. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Bob. And it's good that you're following up on the presentations already made, including remarks by Collins earlier today, who spoke to COP. I wanted you to say something on COP26. So COVID happened, and we don't have the climate change conference this year. But what would be the outstanding issues that would have been captured for this year's COP that are now moved, of course, to the next COP conference?
Okay, thanks very much again. The happening of COVID, unfortunately, doesn't give us guarantees that climate change is also going to be postponed, because of course COVID happened and then it led to the postponement of the COP.
But there was a relationship, and maybe we may want to speak to this, with the lockdowns and the impact of the lockdowns on the environment. I don't know if, I know a lot of extensive work is still being done in trying to measure what the lockdowns contributed to less emissions and less destruction of our environment. That's a conversation that is ongoing, and so it may speak to something you're going to say. Yes.
Yeah, that's a very heated conversation which is ongoing globally, and we know it's all evident that climate change is actually about how do you change the current energy practices that you're dealing with, because that's where the problems are coming from. So it's evident that with the lockdown and with the reduced vehicles and modes of transport everywhere, emissions have reduced globally. But it doesn't come that easy, because we are now going back into the normal mode of how we've been doing things, and that's the challenge that we are faced with. We are talking about how do you change people's behavior so that it resonates with the commitments that we've set ourselves to achieve. Naturally, it happens that we are very more comfortable to do things the usual way that we've done, other than things that we've not done in a long time. I'll give an example. If I've had a habit that I've done for the last 58 years, if I'm 58 years old today, as Uganda is, and I've been repeatedly doing the same habit, driving my vehicle from my home to office, that is not something that is not going to be changed in one day or 1 year because of the policy shift that we are looking at. So what am I saying? What I'm saying, in short, that we need to work with partners like the media and everybody else to ensure that we emphasize on the point of behavior change, because it takes time for people to be able to relate the challenges that we are faced with, but also the actions, whether transport-wise or the consumption modes, to what we've been used to for the last so many years. Back to the point of key issues, I think there are several issues that I can speak to, but I can limit myself to 2 or 3. The first one, as I said earlier, we are an adaptation-first country. And the challenges and impacts that we are faced with as a country and how vulnerable we are as a country puts a spotlight on adaptation. So for us as a country, adaptation is key. I also made mention of the nature-based solutions that we've put aside. So as I said, putting forward nature-based solutions doesn't negate other efforts that we require, for example, finance and technology. So as we go into any COP, I think the issue of finance will always come up, partly because we may not have all the resources that are required to undertake both adaptation and mitigation actions. And I can give an example. When we were doing the national climate change policy, we also did the costed implementation plan. That costed implementation plan reflects that Uganda required at that time about $3.9 billion for the next 15 years. Now that's about $250 million every year. Those are colossal sums of money that we may not have. So the argument within the COPs is that where does this finance come from, and how do we ensure that countries are able to take responsibility of their commitments that they have signed up to, so they are able to meet these commitments. But it doesn't come that easy. That's why we've been at this pace of conversations back and forth for the last 26 years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bob. I'll come to Ronald. So I'll skip Dr. Caliste briefly and come to Ronald, Manager Head Production, Trade and Tourism Planning at the Department at the National Planning Authority. So I want you specifically to speak to the Budget Compliance Assessment Report, which you led a team on, and, you know, together with ACODE and CARE International. Take us through, first of all, the methodology of that assessment, but also it would be nice to know the key findings of that report.
Thank you, Maurice, and thank you, ACODE and CARE, for organizing this dialogue. Before I go through the methodology and the findings, allow me to mention the objectives of this assessment. Now, one of the key objectives of this assessment is to ensure that our budgeting framework is informed by the planning. A budget implements the plan. What we've had before was that we come out with the budget and then we begin thinking of a plan. So one of the key objectives of this assessment was to ensure that what we plan is followed by the budget. This is in line with our thinking as reflected in Vision 2040 and our national development plans. So, the budgeting frameworks should always be aligned to Vision 2040, and these are implemented through our national development plan. Another key objective of this assessment was to evaluate how aligned is the budget for financial year 2021 to the national development plan. How well aligned is the budget for 2021, the sector BFPs, to the climate change interventions that were outlined in NDP 3. The climate change interventions in that plan, and what we want to see are resources going to those interventions. We also want to identify the emerging issues. What are the key messages? What are the recommendations which should come out to inform the integration and implementation of climate change, interventions? So there was also that objective. And lastly, wanted to use the assessment as a means of enhancing advocacy and lobbying for climate change mainstreaming in sector plans, policies, and annual budgets. And I want to mention here that the assessment of the budget is a legal requirement under the Public Finance and Management Act of 2015, which requires that the annual budget shall be consistent with the National Development Plan. So, given those objectives, we went forward to carry out the assessment. In terms of the methodology, one, we sampled out 9 NDP3 programs. NDP has got 18 programs. We identified 9 of them. These are many, but we had sectors, programs such as agro-industrialization, tourism, health, education, works and transport. And as you'll note, these are sectors with high levels of vulnerability to the impacts of climate change. So, in the selection of these sectors or programs to be assessed, we're also informed by the NDC, which Bob, the nationally determined contribution, which Bob has mentioned. We're also informed by the Uganda National Climate Change Policy. Of course, it also identified those sectors which are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. We got both qualitative and quantitative data. This was obtained from NDP3. We also looked at the sector, the budget framework papers of the sectors that we are looking at. And these are the budget framework papers of 2021. We looked at them. We also have what we call the NDP3 results framework, which has got targets, indicators, interventions, and the key outputs. These are the tools where we got the data, the qualitative and the quantitative data that we used. And we looked at what are the interventions that were outlined in NDP3. What climate change interventions are in NDP3? And then, do the budget framework papers earmark resources for those climate change budget interventions? That's how we looked at that and we assessed that. We looked at the level of compliance. Are there budget allocations to those interventions in NDP3 in the budget framework papers? We developed a criteria, a very rigorous criteria, a criteria which we have always been using in assessing budgets developed by the National Planning Authority. We had variables such as temperature, rainfall, and of course, these are climate change variables that we looked at, and these are associated with many impacts that Dr. Kalista has been mentioning and Bob. So we looked at NDP3, and then how are the sectors in their budget framework papers addressing those interventions. And then we had a formidable team comprised of representation from the National Planning Authority. The CCD was represented. We also had ACODE in that team, that technical team. We reviewed and scored sectors. There were scores for these sectors. So I think that's the methodology. And the second question was on the key findings. Is that so, Maurice? Yes, the key findings. Now, one of the fundamental findings that we looked at here is that we are gaining progress in planning for climate change interventions. NDP3 sector plans have got climate change interventions, which is a very good development, but we see non-compliance at budgeting level, non-compliance at execution level. So I think we've done very well in mainstreaming climate change, in budgets, policies and plans, in plans, but we are weak on budgeting for those interventions. So the action levels, we don't see evidence of climate change interventions being captured in the budgets. I think that was a key finding that we got. Another key finding is that there are no clear budget lines for climate change priorities. When you look at a sector budget, clear budget lines for climate change interventions are not there. They're just put together, lumped together in outputs. You do not see them clearly. Explicitly, you can't see these interventions. So, therefore, there are no specific budget allocations for climate change if you look at the sector budget framework papers. We also noted that climate change is looked at as a cross-cutting issue, like gender and others. But I want to add on here that unlike other cross-cutting issues, which are qualitative in nature, which just affect the level of development outcomes, climate change goes beyond that, in that it is a survival, it affects livelihoods. Yes, it affects livelihoods, it affects growth. So while climate change issues are cross-cutting, they are being addressed in a fragmented manner. We do not have an integrated framework which addresses climate change issues. Yet there are linkages that we have to look at. Dr. Kalista has mentioned the catchment management, which you have to begin from somewhere. So it requires an integrated and holistic approach to address issues of climate change. The capacity to also understand the implications of climate change at sector levels is also low. How do you link climate change to sector outcomes? How does climate change affect, for example, national defense? How does climate change affect health? How does climate change affect, macroeconomic stability? This linkage is not understood and doesn't come out in our policies, in our, planning. Another key finding that we found out is that the prioritization of climate change in sector budgets, sector plans is low. We have it in NDP3, but in sector plans, sector budgets is low. That therefore means that sectors do not plan for climate change interventions, and therefore the vulnerability of our people. If Ntoroko local government had planned for climate change, maybe the vulnerability to floods would have been minimal. So this vulnerability is as a result of low prioritization of climate change in our development, in our planning process. And I want to say that again, given that assessment, some sectors, the average score of all sectors was 35%. That was the mark. That was the average score. Please, 35% is below pass mark. Meaning that...
Yeah, I was about to say that is really very bad. It's close to failure.
It's close to failing. That's what
failure,
the average
actually,
score.
Yeah.
And the highest score was 78%. And we had some sectors scoring zero. Zero. Nothing at all in their budget which reflects, climate change interventions. I think that's the methodology and the key findings that I want to point out.
All right, before I let you go, Ronald, let's talk about the critical actions that should be undertaken by the sectors so that we actually integrate program planning and budgeting. Because you speak to the findings and the methodology, but we want to say, what are those suggestions you made as a team?
Okay. I thank you.
Even in marking the scores, yes. What was that template like, so that we also know the key actions you'd have expected these sectors to undertake to be able to score 100%?
All right. Let me say, just before I come to that question, we need to look at this period as a key opportunity where we are determining our political landscape in the next 5 years. How do we use the political landscape as the key entry point for climate change interventions? We need to mainstream climate change in the manifestos of parties, such that when they come in power, they implement climate change. And I want to ask ACODE to review the manifestos of these political parties to see to what extent they have integrated climate change. That will be key for our assessment in the next years to come. And yes, another key intervention or a recommendation that I want to make is that we need to increase the cost of not budgeting for climate change to sectors and accounting officers. If you don't budget for climate change, what are the implications to you as an accounting officer, but also to the sector? I think there should be sanctions which should be undertaken in terms of budget cuts and also incentive for those sectors which prioritize climate change. And this therefore points to the role of Parliament, the Parliamentary Committee on Budget, Parliamentary Committee on Climate Change, the Minister of Finance, the Office of the Prime Minister should be looking at this. These are recommendations. Now, from the findings that we had, we discover that there is a lot of off-budget support to climate change. Off-budget support to climate change. So we need to realign off-budget support, and this off-budget support should come to climate change. And the development partners here, you should emphasize that climate change interventions are captured in the off-budget support. So government should foster the integration of climate change response actions in the NDP3 in projects I know that many ministries have got many projects. And this is where development finance, is given to the ministries. But climate change issues are not reflected in those budgets. And many of these, projects are off budget. So I think we need to look at that as a critical factor in mainstreaming climate change. Now, the Minister of Finance is at the center of it all. The Minister of Finance should expedite the development of climate change budget tagging. It's very difficult to trace budget intervention in a budget framework paper. And these are very big documents. We need budget codes in the budget framework papers, climate change, codes, such that you can trace budget interventions. Sometimes you have to think, is this budget addressing climate change issues directly or indirectly? So we need the Minister of Finance to move very fast on climate tagging to be able to track the expenditures, the public expenditures, and make them consistent to NDP3, process. Now, to put the country on a sustainable development, a development footing, climate change compliance assessment should be adopted in our annual budgets. This should not be a one-off intervention. It should be going on over the years. And I want to ask ACODE to continue partnering with the NPA to see that this, goes on and is part of our budget, assessment. We have what you call a results framework. A results framework is a key element of any plan. It has interventions, it has outputs, it has indicators, it has targets. It has financial allocations and it assesses, progress. It's a critical tool that is used to monitor the performance of a plan. We need climate change indicators to be part of the national indicator framework, such that we know what kind of, results have been scored in terms of climate change. And ministries, departments, and agencies should have monitoring frameworks that have got climate change indicators. And my colleague Bob here should support the ministries to understand and to come out with climate change indicators. These are technical. They require technical support to develop these indicators, and development partners, this is a critical area of support that we need to look at. Again, Bob and Dr. Kalista have mentioned the need for collaboration. Climate change mainstreaming requires partnerships, collaboration at different levels. Collaboration between sectors, collaboration with the National Planning Authority, the Minister of Finance, Office of the Prime Minister, and the non-state actors, all these should come on board, and we should go beyond, climate change goes beyond the mandates. We need an integrated and holistic approach to climate change issues. If you want to solve catchment issues, you don't look at the jurisdiction of a given district. It goes beyond. So we need to go beyond the mandates, and we need a holistic and integrated approach.
Finally.
Lastly, yes, finally. The negative effects of climate change notwithstanding, we need to see opportunities in climate change. Opportunities for income, opportunities for employment, opportunities for wealth creation. We need to be innovative in tapping those opportunities that climate change presents. If you look at energy, solar engineers, solar panels, dealers in solar, these opportunities that climate change has brought. We need to identify them and tap them. I submit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ronald. You spoke to something that I want Dr. Kalista to come back to, that stakeholder engagement, the conversation that should be happening between the ministry, the local governments, the MDAs, and of course the civil society organizations on enhancing synergies in managing water catchment areas to enhance climate change resilience. But, you know, speaking to the language of Bob, you know, carbon print, emissions, these things, and I'm happy we are talking on television because there is people watching at home. These things, the Muntu Wawansi doesn't know about carbon print. You know, all he knows is he must feed his family at the end of the day, and he must be able to have light in his house. How he does that is another question, but what engagement are we having?
Thank you very much, moderator. First of all, as you rightly said, we need to make sure that the people on the ground are part of this discussion. And that's why, as the Minister of Water and Environment, we felt that we need to bring issues to the people. Let the people, first of all, understand that there is a problem. And then they know what is causing that problem and what needs to be done to address that problem. And we feel the people have the answers. So our catchment approach is basically saying, let's put the stakeholders in the driver's seat so that they look at the issues, they internalize the issues, they know what is causing the issues. Some of these issues are caused by them. And they need to know that if they don't address these issues, then they will not have any future. So our catchment approach is stakeholders driven. For the first time, we are opening up space for stakeholders who traditionally will not talk with each other to dialogue. We have the private sector, we have the civil society, the cultural institutions, the religious institutions, local governments, central government institutions, all discussing issues together. And we are creating what we call catchment management organizations. And each catchment has a representation of all of those stakeholders. And we are already seeing people coming up and responding positively, but also for them to understand that there is a problem. And I think for a long time, as government, we have been taking on the burden as if we have all the answers. But I think the answers are out there, and we're already seeing in the 18 catchments where we are working, people are taking the bull by the horn, and they are already making a difference.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kalis. I wanted, in a very special way, to recognize a member of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Climate Change, the Honorable Miriam Mujenyi. She's been here with us, yes. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. And I'm also informed we may have other members of Parliament joining us later. All right. The conversation is a bit open. Raymond, I'm not sure if we have a microphone that is roving. I wanted, you know, in case you have a comment or question for any of the gentlemen in front of us, that we can actually get the comment through. Please keep it short, introduce yourself, and then direct your question or whatever the comment is to a particular person. The lady at the back there, please introduce yourself. Any other person? I need to see so that I can gauge. I don't have a lot of time. Okay, the gentleman here and the lady there. All right, and the lady. This is very well balanced. So I have the 4 people.
Good morning, colleagues. I am Jalia Kopsinge from the European Union delegation. Mine is a comment to, I think, a reaction from Bob and Mr. Kwagwa to one of the questions raised to them. The issue of what can be done differently or what is being done differently. Yes, climate change is not a new thing and has been there, but also drawing from a question from Maurice, I think it was your first question about what the lockdowns have meant for our environment, speaking generally. Yes, there are terms and phenomena that you've probably had, things like building back better, green recovery. Yes, there are terms, but it's not very different from what has been advocated for previously. To use this opportunity, in simple terms, to think differently at strategic level, programming level, at actions. Someone mentioned, yes, that if I've been doing something a certain way for 58 years, it might be, and I can draw specific attention to the lockdown. Most people were tied down, not by choice, and therefore couldn't do what they do ordinarily, which is business as usual. But after the release and trying to get back to a normal life, in quotes, many people will do things the same way. Here I'm talking about actions, I'm talking about programs, and even strategic decisions and dialogue. So again, this is an opportunity to use the lockdown or its effects to rethink our strategic decisions. There is a discussion with the Ministry of Finance and the other sectors to look at what government can do differently in terms of thinking ahead for our country, but also globally. This is the Green Recovery Dialogue, that is a global dialogue to see how is climate change being now, climate change, but also the effects of COVID-19 being aligned and mainstreamed into our planning process. And Uganda is at an advantage that we are defining the programs for NDP3, and this is an opportunity we can take.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. The lady, yes, there's a lady there. Here. That lady there, yes.
Thanks, Morris, and good morning. I'm Rita, working with the UNFCCC Regional Collaboration Center, Kampala, with my colleague Siri here. Thanks for the good presentation. So just slightly a question to Mr. Ronald Kagwa about the sort of study you did and coming up with a near zero integration of climate change within some of the sectoral budgets. So I'm just keen to understand what the reason is for this. Of course, I understand that it could be a reason of complexity that comes with the jargon of climate change and understanding how best to tag. You mentioned something about indicators and how CCD can support this work, or Ministry of Water and Environment. So I'm just keen to know what was the reason for this, and have you also through this study sort of tried to come up with ways to address this near zero integration, or getting it to a higher percentage to have this work integrated within the various sectoral budgets? Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. We are having this discussion and dialogue live on television, on NTV, and we want to take a very, very short break for television purposes. So for those of you at home, we will take a TV break, but in the room, you will probably find us in the conversation, on the conversation continuing. So please do stay with us if you're watching on TV and join us after that break. All right, so there is the gentleman here and the lady there, so feel free.
Resources in that. And then I remember we had a meeting in Luzira where we were handing over these indicators for adoption by the government. And we got commitments that government is going to actually use these indicators to integrate within the budgeting framework. So maybe we need to get an update from government again. Maybe, I don't know whether Dr. Kalist can be able to speak to that, or Bob Natif to speak to that. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And finally, the lady behind you. Yes, you can just hand over the microphone. There you go.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. My name is Proskovia Ritanamgugu. I work with those with the Prime Minister, the Climate Change and Disaster Risk Specialist.
Please speak up. We can barely hear you. Yes.
My name is Proskovia Ritanamgugu. I work with those of the Prime Minister as the Climate Change and Disaster Risk Specialist. And my question will go to Mr. Ronald Kagwa, and briefly to Bob Natif. I've worked with this gentleman, and one thing I just want to find out is, to Ronald, you've talked about the assessment report of compliance assessment, but I remember last year when we were discussing about the indicators, we alluded that the guidelines, I think, are becoming, they need to be updated, because with climate change, it keeps evolving all the time and changes all the time. Are these guidelines up to date for us to be able to measure what we want to measure about the mainstreaming of the mainstreaming of climate change interventions in NDP3 and in other sectoral plans? And because I'm from the office of the Prime Minister, I won't forget about on Tuesday, we were able to celebrate the International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction. And what was mainly on this day is about, it's all about governance. Are there systems, when we say we are going back to the district level, the district local governments, are there systems in place whereby when we say we are developing these indicators, are these people ready to integrate the climate change interventions in their sectors and policies? Are they aware? Do they have this capacity to be able to do that? Thank you so much.
All right, thank you very much. Coming back to you, gentlemen. Ronald, you had the bulk of the questions, but it's open to all the three. So when you're done, I'll welcome Dr. Callis and Bob to share. Yes, Ronald.
Thank you, moderator, and thank you, colleagues, for those questions. I want to begin with Jalia's observation. What is new that we are doing differently? What I can say is that we need to look at climate change as an opportunity for job creation, for income, for wealth creation. This is the approach, the green growth approach to climate change. We need to take that view. We need to identify business opportunities in climate change, where people can do climate change as a business, while at the same time solving the challenges that it presents. I've given you clean energy solutions, which are coming up. And many people in town here are employed in green, climate smart, business. And they're surviving on that. The solar business, I've mentioned this. We need green technologies to be brought on board. And investors here in this country, we need to tap those investments. ICT solutions to climate change, developing apps on climate change interventions. I think this is how we can look at climate change as a business, but also live on climate change. That would be an incentive, for change and an incentive for, to move forward. You see many people now growing flower. There are flower beds all over the city. Tree growing all over the city. These nursery beds. That's business, but it's also good for climate change. I think we need to encourage such interventions, and to me, that is something that is new. Now, Rita, reasons for the scores, why they never got, 100%. One, there is limited appreciation of the linkage between climate change and sector outcomes. Do we understand that when there is climate change, there is no macroeconomic stability? Do we associate inflation, unemployment to climate change? At a policy and planning level, do we see that linkage? How does climate change impact on accountability, national accountability? These are key questions which sectors have to know, and being, powered by that knowledge, they can allocate resources to climate change interventions. I think Bob and we, people that are here, we need to do more for people to know that climate change is not for CCD, but for all of us. And that linkage should be brought to the attention of accounting officers, of people in different sectors, including local government. National stability and security depends on climate change. But the people who make decisions at a level look at the security linkages of climate change. They may not know that. It's our role to see that the police will have less troubles if climate change was, well managed. The issues of drought and poverty would reduce, and therefore the challenges that the police faces would, reduce. Mr. Muhindo, I want to appreciate the climate change indicators that you developed. Yes, and these were sector-specific climate change indicators. I think we need now to engage sectors, involve them, to buy and own them, and integrate them in their results framework. This is an activity that can be funded. This is an activity that can be, carried on to engage sectors, to identify relevant indicators, and integrate them in their frameworks. Now, Proscovia, the guidelines that you developed through 5 years, they have ceased to be very relevant. They need to be changed to reflect the new thinking of NDP3, the program approach to development planning. So the guidelines need to be changed. They need to be, need to be changed to say that they reflect the new thinking of NDP3, which is program-based. But also, I want to note here that there are so many cross-cutting issues. There are actually around 16, 17 cross-cutting issues. And COVID-19 is about to be added on as another cross-cutting issue. These are too many for any planner. You can't have 18 guidelines for human rights, for food security and nutrition, for employment, for the youth, for the whatever. We need a framework, a common framework for integration of cross-cutting issues, including climate change. A framework which revolves around the key variables, such as vulnerability, inclusiveness. This is what climate change, guidelines should reflect. And I want to call upon the donors here, the development partners here, to look at the opportunity of developing, a common framework for mainstreaming climate change, cross-cutting issues. One framework, not so many, multiplicity of frameworks which, disturb or distort the planning, and they are cumbersome to our planners. So I think that is how we can be. So in terms of readiness to integrate climate change at the district, there is need for capacity building at that level, constant capacity building. These are big documents, technical documents, which are not easily understood. We need to support, and I want to commend CARE for supporting, CARE and ACODE for supporting districts to internalize climate change issues relevant to them and mainstreaming them. I thank you.
Thank you very much. Bob, you want to?
Okay, thanks very much for the questions, but before I go to the particular issues that were raised, let me start with what Maurice put to Dr. Calist earlier in terms of stakeholder engagement, especially in this climate process. The climate conversation started way back in 1992, so that's a couple of years back. And at that time, and there's so many years that we've come through, is that the firm belief at that moment was that it's only nation states that are able to provide solutions to the problem. But over time, there's been realization that it's not only nation states that are able to offer solutions, and that's why, at least as Government of Uganda, Ministry of Water and Environment, we've been very emphatic in ensuring that in terms of stakeholder engagement, we have an array of stakeholders to partake in this conversation, and we emphasize so much civil society engagement, private sector, youth, and so on and so forth. And with that, everybody has brought a bit of ideas of how we can address this challenge. Jalia from EU raised the question of what we can do differently, but also giving a picture of what transpired, of what's been happening after COVID. As I said earlier, is that the biggest challenge when it comes to addressing climate change is dealing with our attitude and how we are supposed to do things away from how we've been doing it for the last so many years. But that also poses great challenges, especially with the decisions that we are bound to make either as individuals or as different entities wherever we're coming from. But also the challenge of ensuring that you have the requisite finance and technology to help you address those challenges that you've identified. Because ask yourself, in many countries, it's not only peculiar to Uganda, we can act vigorously if a signature event happens. So if you take your time to ask yourself why, it comes down to the reasons that I've emphasized earlier. So with this, for me, the way I see what COVID brings forth, I think it brings lots of opportunities in the climate space. We've already collectively agreed that when it comes to emissions as they were compared to what it is after COVID, I think it is a different picture altogether. But how do you ensure that we maintain that spirit that we had during lockdowns if we have a firm belief that once we change our practices and attitude, it leads significantly to emission reductions? And again, it's a very big challenge. If I can give an example, when it comes to attitude change, I had a lecturer who was Chinese when I was doing my MSc and was teaching us climate mitigation. Then he said that one of their ministers of transport went to China. No, the minister of transport in China went to the UK. See, UK at that time had the best roundabouts, and I think it was trying to sort out the issue of traffic jams, because ideally that's the ideal thing for the roundabouts. So when he went back to China, he gave an instruction that we should make sure that we have roundabouts on all the major roads. And indeed, China has the biggest roundabouts in the world, if you've been there. Did it solve the traffic jam challenge? Actually, it did not. Why? Because people have been used to doing things a certain way for a long time. Like, you know, you come on the roads, a taxi will want to make sure that he has the right of way first without necessarily taking due consideration of the regulations in place. And that's why I said perhaps that could be a soft starting point that we need to drive it in that direction, to see how we can change the attitudes and the mind change that we are faced with. On the issue of guidelines, I think there's been lots of talk about the guidelines. First, one thing we should firmly recognize is that climate change is very, very dynamic. I think it's Prosi who talked about the dynamism of this. I gave a bit of background of where we're coming from in terms of the frameworks that we have. But you can imagine at the time we developed the guidelines at that moment in time, we were so much taking due consideration of the Sustainable Development Goals. But we've just done the carbon management plans in 2015, 2016. So what does that mean? Is that because of the dynamism of the subject matter itself, it also calls for an attempt to ensure that we are up to speed with how dynamic the subject matter is, and ensure that we probably modify the earlier sectoral climate indicators that we had developed. But true, these are things that have been done, and there's already effort to go in that direction to see that they are modified to take care of the dynamism within the climate space. The last point I want to speak to is on the issue of how districts can take action. And I think a lot of talk has been so much about how do you ensure you take forward mainstreaming and so on and so forth. As a ministry, we have embarked on a project to develop, with the support of UNEP DTU, to develop vulnerability indices and maps for the particular districts, because that's the starting point of talking about meaningful mainstreaming beyond what we've been doing for the last couple of years to talking about what districts must do. Once we have those vulnerability maps specific to districts, then we see ourselves moving forward to actually emphasize what the results of those matrices speaks to, and districts can at one point begin talking about actually mainstreaming climate change. But also on the other part, mainstreaming actually only, climate change just adds another layer of burden, because some of these things, and I think I had it in the room, we've been doing over time. But so what difference do we bring? The difference we bring is that we reflect the additional cost that is required. Whether we are able to meet it or not is another discussion that we can have, because we also know the challenges that we have in terms of resource allocation. But that is not for me to speak to, but the ideal part, I think, which we are doing right, is to ensure that we have all these plans in place, and then we'll get to the point where we see how do we mobilize these resources that we require in order to build a resilient community. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bob. Dr. Kalist, in 1 minute?
Yeah, thank you very much. Indeed, I will be in 1 minute. Just a comment I would like to make, and I think building on what Mr. Kagwa mentioned, I think as a country we have an opportunity in the National Development Plan 3 with this program-based approach. I think it is providing us an opportunity for holistic and coordinated planning and implementation. I think something that has been lacking in the country. And I really would want to call upon everybody to take advantage of this. I think this will create opportunities for us to create strategic partnerships, leverage available capacities and resources. And I think as a country we have money, if we can use it efficiently. If we can come together, I think we can do more than we are doing now, and we can help our people to build resilience to climate change. Program planning has started, and I think Mr. Kagwa can help people link up with the various programs, and to me this is a strategic direction that can help the country get out of the problems we are in. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kalist. Bob and Ronald, please do stay where you are. I just want to invite to the panel Mr. Muaya Stephen, the Project Coordinator Enhancing Resilience of Agricultural Landscapes in the Ministry of Agriculture, Animal Industry and Fisheries. And as he takes his seat, the ministry recently developed guidelines for mainstreaming climate change adaptation and mitigation in the sector to build the resilience of stakeholders and enhance their capacity to cope with climate change impacts. The practical step-by-step guidelines are not only critical for mainstreaming climate change adaptation and mitigation in the planning and decision-making processes, but are also timely given the ongoing district development plans, DDPs, at the local government levels. A lot of mileage can therefore be attained if these guidelines are widely disseminated to the stakeholders. I'm not going to begin there, Sir. You know, everyone almost is a doctor when you turn to the panel, because it begins with Dr. Arthur here. So I am very careful sometimes. But Stephen, let's start there, because you're talking to us about mainstreaming the climate change adaptation and mitigation in agriculture sector programs. Let's probably begin there in what the ministry is actually doing, if you want to start us off.
Thank you very much, moderator. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and viewers, if the television is on. First of all, I want to appreciate the opportunity to give us from Minister of Agriculture to participate in this panel and also to provide information. I want to say that the Minister of Agriculture has prepared guidelines for mainstreaming climate change issues into its policies and plans. And basically these guidelines are to help us enhance our action towards a more ambitious effort to address climate change in the sector. First of all, I want to say that agriculture sector in Uganda is the most vulnerable sector. And bearing in mind that smallholders are really the smallest peasants out there, they are the main producers, relying largely on rain-fed agriculture. We also know that agriculture is not mechanized, and therefore there is a lot of energy, a lot of activity that takes a lot of work, but inefficiently in some cases. We also know that there is a very low agro-processing base, and that means that value addition is very limited, and therefore the value of the products that are produced are still require a lot of effort. But notwithstanding, we must recognize that agriculture itself is a major driver of deforestation. It is also a driver of land degradation. Agricultural land itself is highly degraded because of the nature of production, of tilling that populations use. I just want to say that the guidelines need to drive us towards a land degradation neutrality approach for the agriculture sector to make sure that we are able to be efficient and also to be climate, to reduce the climate risk associated with that. And I want to say that agriculture in Uganda produces the highest emission as compared to the other sectors. And we know, we point out livestock as the major area of concern, and here methane from enteric fermentation and also manure management and also from rice cultivation and organic soils, it contributes significantly, probably almost coming to 50% of the emissions from Uganda. It is also very clear that the NAPA in 2007 identified agriculture as the most vulnerable sector. And we know that Uganda, the ministry working with USAID a few years ago, did carry out a vulnerability assessment. And in that report, it was clearly reported that between 2000 and 2013, we lost more than 900 million US dollars because of drought and other climate-related risks, hazards that faced us. These hazards affecting agriculture, mainly drought, floods, variability in the rainfall, temperatures, and of course the hailstorm and others which affect. And we recognize also that the social impacts of climate change are significant. And we note, for example, that food security is a very big problem. You might realize that recently, during COVID started, there was an effort by government to give food to people, but the cost is colossal. It's a big budget, and this is very important that agriculture is sustained on a climate resilient basis to deliver for everybody. I want also to say that we've seen that 24% of our GDP is from agriculture. Often the Minister of Finance is talking about drought having an impact on the economy because of this big contribution, and therefore we must address and mainstream climate issues into agriculture. And of course, we must also recognize that we must reduce the destitution and mortality, which sometimes results from lack of food, famine, and all that. And someone mentioned about gender, and I think it was the care director, the 73% of women are involved in this. Food, water, and fuel is a responsibility of women in our communities, especially in the rural. And because of that, scarcity of these as a result of climate change is impacting women more and affecting us more. And also their unpaid care labor also diverts them from efforts to do more to mitigate vulnerability of their communities. Why are we thinking about mainstreaming, and why should we think about mainstreaming in the agriculture sector? And here we are saying because the sector is highly vulnerable to climate change, to ensure that the policies that we have and the plans actually respond to climate change risks that we have, and also that we are able to attract resources that will enable us to address these climate change impacts and challenges. In addition, we would like to see that there is built capacity within the sector and its stakeholders to address climate change issues. what has Ministry of Agriculture done to try and integrate climate change issues into the sector? First of all, I want to say that we've had a very great support from the Climate Change Department. We've established at the Ministry a Climate Change Committee. We have also established a Climate Smart Agriculture Task Force within the Ministry, which brings about a number of stakeholders, especially the private sector, the civil society, and the other actors to participate together with the Ministry. We have also got the Climate Smart Agriculture Alliance, which is led by the international NGOs, including Oxfam, CARE, World Vision, and CRS, which have worked with the Ministry to deliver this. I want also to say that the Ministry has put in place a Climate Smart Agriculture program. We have developed the Agriculture Sector National Adaptation Program. We have also participated in the National Determined Contribution, where climate smart agriculture constituted a big portion of the first NDC. We have also developed recently what we call the long-term, the agriculture sector long-term low emission and climate resilient strategy. I want to say that in addition to all these frameworks, the Ministry of Agriculture has mainstreamed climate change in a number of its ongoing projects that are addressing climate change. I think we have now seen that there is any project that is starting in the Ministry of Agriculture has the word resilience in its composition. And this is because we believe that resilience in agriculture is very important, and we've got this as a way to move forward. I just want to also add that our effort to put in place these guidelines is another effort that actually works in this direction. And here I want to say that the guidelines put in place outline the policy frameworks for climate change in agriculture. They also outline the agriculture sector policy and the planning processes that we can use to mainstream climate change. It is also outlined clearly the institutional framework for mainstreaming climate change, and also they identify the key stakeholders who, and as well as their roles in actually mainstreaming climate change. The guidelines also provide an entry point and an opportunity on how we can actually mainstream climate change. And also they provide a number of tools that can support this process. And therefore we urge all stakeholders in the agriculture sector to make use of these tools and to make it work. Having said that, I must also say that the policy framework, the guidelines help us to identify 4 levels, which include at the policy formulation process, at the planning process, at the resource mobilization process, and at the programming and implementation process. And at all these levels, we have made effort to take specific action to address the issues of climate change. Ladies and gentlemen, the agriculture sector has also identified some of the areas that must be critically addressed, and these include the irrigation and drainage, crop and land management, livestock, storage and processing, as well as rural transport. These are some of the key areas that we believe are important for us to address and to mainstream, and to mainstream climate issues in this respect. I want also to say that the ministry has taken steps to integrate and work closely with other actors, and I must say that we have the interministerial cooperation framework with key ministries that relate to natural resource management under what we call the strategic investment framework for sustainable land management. And that has also provided us an opportunity to mobilize and work with the Ministry of Water and Environment, the Ministry of Lands, Housing and Urban Development, the Ministry of Trade, Industry and Fisheries and Cooperatives, as well as the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Development. And this is how we are integrating these activities. Thank you very much for giving me that time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Muaya Stephen. And I want to mention that we will have all the panelists available for our plenary discussion after our break. And they will be entertaining more questions just in case we have areas of concern or at least some comments we want to make on the conversation that is actually ongoing. For those of you who are watching us on NTV and joining us online on all the platforms, we want to thank you for joining us. We will be cutting off very shortly so that NTV will continue into normal programming and we'll continue our sessions here. Those will also be provided online and shared on the different platforms, including the ACODE and CARE platforms. We are using the hashtag climate resilience, so please do share your conversation there, but you can tag ACODE, you can tag CARE, and also the various presenters who are here on their social media platforms. Indeed, this climate change conversation continues, and we will be sharing as much as we can on the different platforms for those of you who want to join us. So I want to thank you again for joining us, and please do share the conversation with your other or in your other platforms on WhatsApp and anywhere so that we can actually be the climate change ambassadors that we all must be. So to the panelists, you will bear with me. We'll take a very, very short break and come back to you for a plenary session that will include a conversation we are going to have later in the afternoon with the former district planner of Chenjojo, where we'll be looking at integrating climate change in district development plans with a case study of Chenjojo. That is after our break. So I want to welcome all of you, our guests, to our very short coffee break. My request is that let's get the coffee and come back into the room, and so we can actually continue this conversation and conclude the entire dialogue early enough for us to go to our other businesses. So I want to thank you. You're welcome to coffee, ladies and gentlemen.